Oh, sidebar, just because you're looking for something.
Yeah.
Catherine O'Hara and Eugene Levy were nominated for Emmys this morning.
Yes!
Yay! Best people!
Oh my, why'd that take so long?
I don't know, but thank God it happened while they're still filming their last season, so there could be another one too.
Yeah. Oh my God. How the hell did Eugene Levy become such a hot man in his old age?
God, that man aged well.
I went to a talk back for like season 2, and he walked in and I went, I'm sorry, what? And I've been watching the show, but just in person, I went, oh, whoa, the suit and I'm like, I have a crush on Eugene Levy now.
This is why I love older men. Like, it's about getting better with age. Oh my gosh, he is so attractive.
Ready graphics? Ready theme? Cue graphics.
Good evening. For your information tonight.
Perfect example of what we meant when we started this podcast about the relevance of this show to today, and sometimes the depressing relevance of the show to today.
Jay Thomas as Jerry Gold.
Oh, and I'm a kid again.
And on today's episode,
we'll be talking about season 2, episode 6. Whose garbage is it anyway?
Hi, I'm Lauren.
Hey, this is Jessie.
And welcome to another episode.
Yes, we are on one of the episodes I've been the most excited to talk about, especially with current events.
I've been okay about it.
Lauren is really indifferent to the plot of this episode, the people in the episode.
I don't care.
Probably she doesn't care about this episode.
No, I'm very blasé about this episode.
Yes, exactly. Before we get into why Lauren cares not at all about this episode, I just want to start this by saying I think this episode is a perfect example of what we meant when we started this podcast about the relevance of this show to today, and sometimes the depressing relevance of the show to today, and the topics. The fact that we have in the revival, we had a real life episode about this exact topic, or at least a moment within, in which we talked about climate change and what's happening to our poor environment. It's still going, guys.
It was nostalgic to read some words that I had not heard in a very long time.
You mean polystyrene?
The greenhouse effect?
Oh, there were so many times I was like, oh no. Oh, and I'm a kid again.
I know.
Wow, I remember hearing these words and being able to say them. Like a child knew the word polystyrene far too well.
Well, I used to go to TCBY.
Oh, yes.
Also a 90s reference we've talked about before. And you could only get a certain thing in the non-styrofoam cup.
Yeah.
But I would always ask specifically because, Bette Midler told me to.
We listened to Lady Bette.
Yes. To ask if they could put it in the paper cup instead.
I remember feeling really guilty, and this is from that childhood being raised to not take the polystyrene and the styrofoam. But was when I moved to New York and finally being around Dunkin', because that really wasn't a common thing in the Midwest where I grew up. And
yes,
now
it's a northern thing, right?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a coastal thing.
Coastal, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, Minnesota is Caribou coffee, so it's Starbucks and Caribou out there. Now Dunkin' has made its way, don't worry. But when I moved out to New York over a decade ago, I was like, ooh, now I'm near Dunkin' Donuts, and feeling really guilty that the size that I ordered was in the styrofoam. And I hated the paper tiny cups, but it's mainly because the lids were awful. But I remember feeling really guilty because I can't do a small coffee. That's just not what I do. And I'm so glad to hear that they're finally transitioning away from that, because they were one of the last companies that I recognized being like, oh, you use styrofoam.
Yeah, and I remember as a young adult being sort of fooled into all of a sudden believing that it was recyclable, which technically it is now, but I didn't realize that not in all states.
Yeah.
And so I had been trying to recycle certain things. I was staying away from it as much as possible, but if you would get like Murphy with the food, right? Oh, okay. Well, I didn't want this, but it's recyclable. It'll be fine. Only to find out from a roommate after a certain time I had been doing it that New York did not recycle it. And doing some research, apparently it really has to do with the fact that it's not a moneymaker.
Well, and that's so obviously we have a lot to talk about this episode.
We do, yes.
And I will preface with, we're going to touch several things. The issue of climate change and environmental activism is so large and so nuanced and so complicated that we're just going to provide links to a bunch of resources.
Yes.
It is so important that you educate yourself, and we're not going to be able to cover everything, nor fully explain the nuance of all of these things. But one of the things I find the most interesting that we're going to kind of talk about is the myths that we are given and the kind of bait and switches that we are given. I'm really fascinated in the plastic straw banning. And, you know, one of those things is the reaction that we have in this episode that we still have today, which is like, well, I'm doing my best.
Yeah,
But
that was a really important part, I feel, of the episode.
yeah, well, we'll talk about when she orders from the restaurant and the whole like, well, I asked, what am I supposed to do? So there's it feels like a very new episode. I'm actually,
Yes.
this episode is the first one, and granted, we're only in episode 6 of season 2, but it is the first one where I was getting viscerally angry watching it that this is not streaming. I was very angry that I cannot share this episode and make people watch it.
I know.
It's so well done. It's such a great balanced argument, and it makes me angry that I don't have the ability to make people watch this episode. So we'll do our best to recap it.
Do we? Anyway, so this episode was directed by, shocker, Barnett Kellman.
Who?
Someone. And it was written by Cy Duquesne and Denise Moss, who, to remind you guys, still not on staff. They were freelancing, considering they've written more episodes so far this season than most of the regular staff members.
Yeah, they're killing it.
A lot of freelance people. It aired November 6th, 1989. And just to remind everybody, which we talked about in the first season, it's how you play the game, which we do recommend you go back, because we're not going to talk about the history of the character of Jerry Gold, because we already have in this episode. But technically, because Russ Woody created so much of the character in the dialogue, he is credited as creating Jerry Gold, not Cy and Denise, which is interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Well, it's there's the creating the mystique of Jerry Gold and the character and the mention and the name recognition and the idea of Jerry Gold that Russ did, and then having these two writers take that and then actually create the man.
Yes.
It's like Russ created the myth and the legend, and they created the man.
And then Jay came in, who we'll talk about as well, and taking what Russ created and what Cy and Denise created and coming together, and we have this full-fledged character.
And my goodness, there's just something so wonderful about watching a character walk in and who is so already fully realized. It's so rare that a recurring character starts that full.
Yeah. He had so much anticipation, so that when he walks in the room, you go, oh, that's Jerry Gold.
Well, and we'll talk about like everything that they say in response. You know, Murphy says, Frank says, Jim says, Corey, like every like one line that they have in reaction to when he appears is so full of a history with this person. Like Cy and Denise wrote this so well. Like you really understand their point of views. You get an idea with the way they say things about their histories with him, previous interactions. I mean, Corky has a very specific previous interaction that she talks about. But I've seen it very rarely. As I was watching this episode, I was thinking about other characters where I've seen this happen, and the number one for me is Beverly Leslie on Will and Grace.
Oh, that's a good one. Great, yeah.
That's somebody who walked in and were just so that guest character that it only grew from there. It wasn't somebody where it was like, oh, here's kind of a sketch of, and then over time they really get into it. This one, like the second that Jerry and Murphy start interacting, I'm like, oh, there it is. Like you see the future.
And another actor who's been on Murphy Brown. So there you go. This episode aired November 6th, 1989. And the title, Whose Garbage Is It Anyway? Is a takeoff the film Whose Life Is It Anyway? Which is a Richard Dreyfuss film.
Oh, Richard.
Which is funny because Jay Thomas and Richard Dreyfuss worked together extensively.
Yeah.
Particularly people will probably remember him from Mr. Holland's Opus.
Literally the first thing I thought of when I saw Richard Dreyfuss's name. I was like, oh, Mr. Holland's Opus.
So I'll go more into that when I talk about Jay's career.
Because, of course, they're forever linked.
Yes. So the song is Mercy, Mercy Me, which also has a sub sort of parenthesis, Oh, the Ecology. Its lyrics were written and produced by Marvin Gaye, who sang the song. It was released June 10th, 1971. which was a year after Earth Day was established, interesting enough. And it is, unlike other songs that we have, is actually about the environment. It really fits perfectly into this episode. It was the second single from his critically acclaimed 11th studio album, What's Going On. It peaked at number 4 on the pop singles chart of US Billboard. And it was the first time that he really sort of veered away from love songs. You know, this was meant to be a social political commentary. In fact, the rumors are, or the sort of lore, is that Berry Gordy didn't know what ecology meant. Yeah. He wrote the song in collaboration with 2 Motown hitmakers, Al Cleveland, who did I Second That Emotion, which has been on Murphy Brown before, Baby, Baby, Don't Cry. These are all Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. He also helped write What's Going On, which was, we just mentioned, was Marvin Gaye's big hit. And Four Tops member Ronaldo Benson, also known as Obi. Gaye sang background vocals on the track along with the very famous female sessions group, the Andantes, which we will go into later on in future episodes because they do come up again. And the Funk Brothers, who we love to talk about on the show. And it is actually considered one of the most famous and successful songs of Gaye's entire career, which is pretty amazing.
It's amazing. When that song starts playing, it's really... Well, let's talk about Marvin Gaye for a second. So Marvin Gaye is a legend. This song, to me, is one of those songs where you hear it and that, like, smooth... sexy sound of his voice as it comes in on like the "Oh Mercy Mercy." It's so quintessentially him. The certain singers have that quality, and when the song comes in, it just washes over you in such a truly iconic way, and you just start moving. You can't help it. So Marvin Gaye is actually a junior. I didn't realize that.
Yes.
Yeah, he was born Marvin Pence Gaye Jr., most notably known as the Prince of Soul. He was born in Washington, D.C. on April 2nd, 1939. He was raised by a reverend, a very strict household. He grew up singing in church, as is very common for singers of this ilk. He was best known for his work as a soul singer-songwriter with Motown in the 60s and 70s. He produced his own records, and as you alluded to, he became very famous for the love songs. In the late 50s, he joined a vocal group called the New Moonglows that really helped lift him out of doing church revivals into love songs. And that's that really sexy, syrupy voice that we love so much. Became very famous for that. Now, Marvin's first certified hit under his own name didn't happen until 1962. But he was one of those people that the early years were all behind the scenes successes. He was a session drummer for Little Stevie Wonder, the Supremes, the Marvelettes, and Martha and the Vandellas.
I never knew that. So cool.
Yeah, right? He became kind of known as Motown's Renaissance man. He went on to break the top 40 for the first time on his own in 62 with his single Hitchhike. Now, throughout the 60s, he continued to show that range, which is why so many people wanted to duet with him. He worked a lot with Diana Ross and Mary Wells. There was Can I Get a Witness? And I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Things, these huge songs that we just grew up knowing. I love that biography.com, which is where I got a lot of this information. For 3 high-flying years, Gaye and Tammy Terrell wowed the country with their soaring duet performances of songs like Ain't No Mountain High Enough and If I Could Build My Whole World Around You. They were known as kind of the royal couple of R&B.
I love them.
So much. So as you mentioned, in 1970, he was inspired by the escalating violence and political unrest over the Vietnam War, which is what led him to writing What's Going On. And it really changed his entire trajectory because what he was able to do was pull his Motown following into kind of a new era of his career, taking more risks with his music and his politics. And that's what led to Mercy, Mercy Me and all these things. He had a bunch of crossover success. We could talk about Marvin Gaye all day, but primarily these were the big things he was known for. And What's Going On really changed the game for artists of that genre being able to cross over and not just do love songs, not just be tokenized love crooners. Now, he had a little bit of a comeback in 1982, working on his last album, Midnight Love, and the lead single from that is the highly known Sexual Healing, which was a huge comeback for Marvin Gaye. And it earned him his first 2 Grammy Awards and an American Music Award for Favorite Soul Single. And that was toward the end of his career. So, unfortunately, 2 years later, he died very tragically. Essentially, he was killed by his father after a physical altercation. It's a very complicated issue. I recommend looking it up. I don't want to speak for all parties involved. It was very tragic. And 3 years after his death, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. there's a very interesting quote that was, at the end of his career, he admitted he no longer made music for pleasure. Instead, he said, I record so that I can feed people what they need, what they feel. Hopefully I can record so that I can help someone overcome a bad time.
That's nice.
Oh, Marvin.
So shall we get into some Jerry Gold?
Let's get into some Jerry
Let's
Gold.
do it.
I mean, if you're okay with that, Lauren.
We've been waiting like 2 years to talk about him. And there's the thing.
2
We're
whole
only going to talk
years.
about him mostly in context of this episode, which means there's so much more that I can't necessarily say.
Yes, we have lots of
I may
time.
allude to, we really try to stay away from spoilers as much as possible, but there might be a little bit about, the future of Jerry, but I don't think it's too much of a spoiler. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's go.
All right, so we open on Mercy, Mercy Me playing over, and it is a really depressing and well done opening of the various forms of environmental negative impact thanks to us humans. We get shots of really dark bus exhaust. We pass over some power plants. It might be the same ones when I go to visit my fiance's family in Southern California, and we get off at LAX and drive for a while. There's this section of power plants that we pass by every time, and I'm always just haunted by the sight of that. And these might be the same ones because LA.
Yeah.
We just get to watch that beautiful LA traffic of many lanes all backed up going in both directions. I wrote, we see a vial of something sitting in water. We see a sign at a beach that says water polluted today, swimming may be hazardous. We, in the worst moment of my time in this episode, see a sea otter that's covered in oil, in which I just wrote, in all caps. Now, if our... I'm
No, I was
sorry.
going to say, I wish that everyone could see your face because when you talked about it, I just saw just the... Yeah.
So for our listeners who don't know, I know that it's kind of a trendy thing to love sea otters. Y'all don't know. You don't know. So I grew up half my life in Alaska as the daughter of a tour guide. I fell in love with sea otters at a very young age. They're basically like my sea alter ego. They're sea cats. I love them. When I see them, I start crying. It's a thing. There's a joke that my bachelorette party is going to be at that place in California where baby river otters swim upon you. They're my babies. Now, part of this is because I grew up in Alaska, and I remember as a child with my dad's tour groups and in school learning about the 1989 Exxon oil spill in Valdez, Alaska. It is, we reference Exxon in this
Yes, we do.
episode, and the oil spill happened on my birthday, my third birthday, March 24th, 1989. Was a man-made disaster. It occurred when the Exxon Valdez, an oil tanker owned by the Exxon Shipping Company, spilled 11 million gallons of crude oil into Alaska's Prince William Sound. It was the worst oil spill in U.S. history until the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010. I grew up as a child going down specifically to Seward, Alaska, where they have a sea life center. And it was well into my older childhood when there were people out there still working on cleaning up the effects of this oil spill. And there were all these famous shots of the sea otters, of the birds, of all of the different sea life being cleaned up and trying to save them from this horrible disaster. And they say nearly 30 years later, pockets of crude oil still remain in some locations. Seeing that sea otter shot, I'm almost positive it's from the
of
Exxon
course.
spill.
It must be.
It's a very specific pain to me. I spent most of my childhood guilty that happened on my birthday and happened to these wonderful animals in this area I grew up. It's a very personal problem for me that I feel so guilty. Like I have all these little childhood things, like the Challenger blew up the year I was born, and the oil spill happened on my third birthday. I have all these random things that I feel existentially very guilty about. So I feel attacked by the editors of the opening of this episode of Murphy Brown.
I can see why.
It hurts, people. It hurts. Anyway, so we continue from My Poor Baby Sea Otter. We see trash in the streets, and slowly we come out of this opening segment into an interview on FYI. Murphy is thanking the person we only see the back of at this moment, but it's a female scientist named Dr. Sakura. She thanks this leading environmental scientist that she's given a lot of frightening details, but let's make it more personal. And Murphy posits this. It's 2050 in America. If we've made no changes in our attitudes or behavior, what is life like? And I'm going to read you this little
You
statement
should, yeah.
that Dr. Sakura says. Well, I hope you're ready for this. You wake up on a summer day and find the mercury is already over 100 degrees. There have been a lot more of these hot days due to the greenhouse effect. And the air is so dirty. School children are not allowed to play outside most days of the year. Maybe you want to seek relief at the beach, but hotter temperatures have caused rising sea levels. Many of our beaches are gone forever, and even if you could find a beach, the water has been off limits for 3 decades due to pollution. So you head indoors. As you walk in, you are assaulted by the sight and smell of garbage. It's everywhere. We ran out of places to dump it decades ago. Now, just for reference, following this, when she says 3 decades ago, the beaches were off limits due to pollution, that's next year.
Yeah, and 2050 and a lot of the research that I've read from back then and now is a date that comes up a lot.
Yes, I actually have. I think it's from National Geographic, or I have an article that specifically still references 2050 and where we are and what needs to be done. That is kind of the big year, but unfortunately, a lot of people are still looking at that, not realizing that currently we still have about a decade to change things.
Yeah. Well, they're saying 12 years now, right? Yeah.
Yep. This is where it is. So the Washington Post, I found an article where I was like, let's look up 2050. As of last October, the Washington Post did a great article that we will link to. But talking about specifically emissions, by 2050, a recent report calls for a total or near total phase out of the burning of coal.
Yeah.
And if we don't do that, we need to either stop emissions entirely by 2050 or find some way to remove as much carbon dioxide from the air as humans put there, meaning that net zero needs to be the new global mantra. This date has been around for decades.
Yeah, that was the sad thing in the research is that all of these call to arms, so to speak, you know, they're not new. They've been saying them for a while now. And this became a real topic in the 90s because of this. But also in 1988, it was a very hot summer. And it made a lot of scientists and a lot of people kind of go, well, I shouldn't say scientists, probably more the human beings go, maybe this is something we should pay attention to. I mean, I'm sure.
Imagine.
Yeah. It was a combination of a lot of things, I should say. But particularly why there is so much happening in 1989 in terms of articles and political rhetoric was because of this really hot summer, particularly happening in 1988.
And I actually think that that's one of the most problematic things for us in causing the phrase global warming, because I think there are many problems and there's a lot of rhetoric that's been picked up and used for various terrible means. But one of the things that really stands out is this concept of global warming and the fact that all these were coming up because there was a hot summer. So then you have the people that are saying, well, if the winter's so cold, then it's not warming.
Ugh.
And the number of people that are looking for warmth as the key to climate change and really just simplifying and missing the nuance. So I'm kind of glad that now we're saying the phrase climate change more than we're saying global warming, because that was such an easy way for people to get out and be like, well, the summer wasn't as hot.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this conversation continues and there's more terrible things we're going to talk about.
Yes. Except the episode.
So Murphy asks, except the episode, which is great. Murphy asks after that speech, is it too late to turn things around? Which is a question we're still asking. And Dr. Sakura says, not yet, but we Americans have got to stop living in a waste mentality. We throw out twice as much garbage per person as the average Japanese and European, and our air pollution, half of it comes from our own tailpipes. Murphy has this great moment when she turns around and starts addressing the audience. She thanks Dr. Sakura, which, by the way, I just want to call out, is an Asian American woman.
Yes.
So, yay, appreciating that. And she tells everyone that she asks the audience if we're going to go out killed by our own wasteful lifestyles. She charges the audience that we have to give up these petty comforts and conveniences, that we are living in the last chance decade. And to hear that 30 years ago.
And on a completely superficial level, if we can talk about the camera for this particular episode, which is something we've never seen, which is we see a full view of the FYI studio, meaning that where the audience watching this television show within a show would have been, although technically my understanding is, now that I think about it, is that set was off to the side, that the audience really could only see it on camera, but still the fourth wall where the cameras would be for the show Murphy Brown is a wall, because because Barnett has a 360 camera turn on Murphy and her interviewee. The understanding behind this is that because it's so much talk, is that he wanted motion to it. He wanted to make it still be sort of engaging to people. And I really think it works.
Well, what I really appreciate, and I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to talk about it, was while this speech is happening, and the actress who plays Dr. Sakura does such an amazing job with pace. She does it. It takes far more time than how I just read it. Her pacing and the gravitas that she puts behind this statement is so moving and serious. And as she's doing it, the way Barnett spins it is you hear the words, but they almost become a voiceover as you watch, you see that the entire studio is being affected.
Yeah, they're riveted.
And you see as they go across the rest of the gang at their desk at one point, and you just see the guilt and the concern and the stakes of what she's saying across this desk, and you see the PAs behind the cameraman watching. Like, no, everyone has stopped. There is no bustle. Everyone is listening, and it brings such a wonderful, and I would say even including Murphy's direct address to her audience. It really does that wonderful thing without completely hitting us over the head. It's a wonderful kind of breaking a fourth wall meta moment of talking to Murphy's audience, but also the audience of the show. Mm-hmm. And it makes everyone kind of step out of the disbelief or the suspension of disbelief of filmmaking. And it makes everyone realize that everyone's listening. Everyone is watching.
Yeah.
And thank goodness. That's why I'm so angry I can't share this episode. Anyway, so Murphy ends her direct address with one of my favorite Native American proverbs, which is, "We do not inherit the land from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." And as we fade out, we find ourselves at Phil's. And at that moment, Phil is walking over to the corner of the bar, hands a glass of water to a businessman who's really focused on what he's doing. And Phil's just extra chatty right now. Not our normal Phil who doesn't want to talk to his random clients.
FYI, really, informed him this week.
Yeah, he's really fascinated by that episode of FYI tonight. It had some interesting information, and he's asking this businessman who's kind of just ignoring him. Did you know when people order a glass of water from an establishment, it actually takes 3 glasses? 1 glass to wash, 1 to rinse, and 1 for the ice. And the other guy is just like, head down. Yeah, right. And Phil just goes, drink the water. I love the real life application of that.
Yeah.
Like, as he was saying that stuff, I started to feel really guilty. I was like, oh, you're right. Because again, it's still relevant. We pan out to the hero table where the gang is sitting, and Miles comes in from the door. He apologizes. He's late because the switchboard was going crazy. There were 342 positive calls and only 1 negative. To which Corky's like, who would call in negative? Oh, Exxon. They said we should lighten up. Which, Exxon. Do you know what he cheers to? I don't have subtitles, so I couldn't figure. It's to the something.
Oh, I didn't write that down. I don't know.
I listened to it about 5 times this morning.
I mean, a lot of times
I realized,
Miles will cheers to, like, the team or all of them.
I think it was something like team, but I could not figure it out.
That's so funny. I didn't write it in my notes. My notes are mostly about Jerry.
To the blank. You know what? Speaking of Jerry, the door opens and someone enters. Lauren.
Jay Thomas as Jerry Gold with a newspaper under his arm and a cigarette.
That he lights as soon as he gets to the corner of the bar.
Because you can do that in bars back then.
Yes. It's funny to me how recently you could do that in bars. I mean, I remember in college going to Perkins, and the smoking section was just like a non-closed archway difference.
Yeah, it was like, this is a smoking table. And it's like, well, it's right next to the non-smoking table.
It's in the non-smoking
Oh God,
air.
remember that when they'd be like smoking or non? Oh my God, I just had a huge flashback of that's such a thing that certain generations don't know. Going to a restaurant with your family and asking, do you want to be in the smoking or the non-smoking?
Smoking or non-smoking.
Oh my God, I had like totally burned that out of my brain.
Well, and I remember waiting longer for a table because you didn't want to be in the smoking section.
Yeah, exactly. We did. We always had to wait. Crazy.
Yep. Oh,
back to Jerry.
Nice changes. So before we get into our little sidebar about Jay and Jerry, I just want to read the individual snap reactions.
Yes,
to seeing
please.
Him. So we see him walk in. He lights up the cigarette. And there, Murphy, the first to spy him, says, no, Jerry Gold. Like there isn't enough pollution.
Love it.
Frank says a very interesting line, which is, shouldn't he be rounding up guests for next week's show, or did the world run out of wife-swapping skinhead transvestites? To which I also want to say, while that is a problematic phrase, I think I just want to call it the fact that I think it's actually more a commentary on Jerry's show
Yes.
than it is the writers or Frank. I don't think that either of them, quote unquote, came up with that phrase. I think it's a commentary that was a headline Jerry just had.
Yeah, and going back to
That Jerry and his people suck.
Yeah, and going back to when we talked about that kind of television in the first time Jerry Gold's name is mentioned, that was rampant on daytime.
Yeah. And that was the point. Like, that is the like, we hear more and more what Jerry has on
Yeah.
his show. Like, the point was that he was as offensive as
Yeah,
possible.
I want to say, I know Jerry's not a daytime show, but I just think of like Donahue and stuff like that.
Exactly. And then we get to Jim's reaction, which is one of my favorite through lines of this segment. He says, I don't know what it is about him.
Oh.
He gets to me like no one else can.
Can I take a moment
Yeah.
here? So I pulled up
Yeah.
the script because I realized we have the script for this episode. Miles says to the A-team.
Oh, he says to the A
To the A-team, which I doubt is going to be actually a reference to the A-team. I think it just means as in like the front team, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like we are team A.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you for finding that.
You're welcome.
we had
Because I
access
realized
to that
also
somewhere.
we have the description of Jerry, which I know we like to read on the show, the first description of characters. When Jerry walks in, he's described as a guy in a bad sports jacket enters. He reeks of bad taste, smugness, and his ever-present Marlboros. This is Jerry Gold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like they summed it up well.
Very well. Yeah.
Yeah, he really lived that.
Yes. Continue, Jesse.
So Jim is frozen beyond normal Jim stiffness.
Yes.
And he says, I don't know what it is about him. He gets to me like no one else can. Makes me so mad every time. I just can't. The words don't. I could just... And then he just drinks. Jim in this segment at Phil's
Firm.
is, oh my God. Just get ready. I'm going to read them all.
Yeah.
And then Corky says, oh no, he's coming over here. He always touches me.
Yeah. So I want to remind our audience that this was not the first episode of Jerry Gold that I saw. My introduction to Jerry Gold was as a love interest in his end of season 2 episode, Heart of Gold. So I did not see this episode for years of being
This
a
version.
big, Jerry Murphy shipper. And obviously this is, before Jerry evolved a bit as a character. But I am not cool with him always touching Corky without permission. Just want to put that out there.
And let's be again. Let's remind that it is important for us to balance holding pop culture accountable from a modern perspective,
Exactly.
and also recognizing the time period.
I agree.
The thing that I like about this moment is, as opposed to it being something where it's like it's fine, it was the 80s or the 90s. What I like is that this behavior of his is abhorrent in this episode. It is not something that we're just shrugging off. Like, part of it is the fact that he is that guy.
Yeah.
He is that, like that predecessor to Bill O'Reilly that comes over and calls a woman sweet cakes and touches her too much and does what he does at the end of the segment, which we will talk about later.
It sets him up.
So what I appreciate, it sets him up very well as a, Jerry would not be doing well in the Me Too era.
No, he would not.
Like this.
No, not this Jerry. And it's funny that you say Bill O'Reilly, because in one of the last interviews that Jay Thomas did before he passed, I'm not sure how long, but it was one of the ones that I could find. He was on the Gilbert Godfrey podcast, and he referenced Jerry Gold, that he felt, as in a Today reference, that he would be like a Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah, it's so interesting being 3 decades later and seeing what came of those people. And it is, it's not far from, the Alex Jones that we have now. So before we get into Jerry's interaction with the group, do we want to talk a little bit about?
Yes, let's talk about Jay Thomas.
Shall we? I'm sorry, Lauren, do you want me to take this as the Jay and Jerry?
I'm not really prepared.
That's what I thought. As she picks up, you can't see this, but as she picks up sheets of paper. No one is more ready to talk about a character.
I mean, I could probably do it without the paper, but I was so afraid that I would forget something, So I wanted at least a little cheat sheet for myself, because
Lauren, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Although I do have some new information that I thought of as I was prepping this.
Oh.
I believe that to describe to people just how much Jay Thomas worked in the 90s on television, which was one of the reasons why I became such a big fan, was because he was on everything. I mean, I particularly liked him on Murphy Brown. That was where I found him and loved him the most. But as someone who wanted to be an actor and a working actor, I would go, oh, well, he's on everything. So, of course, when I was a kid, I didn't realize how lucrative season regular contracts were as a kid. So I thought, well, that sounds like a great job, going from show to show and playing a different character all the time and having all this, creativity to play all these different parts and be on all the shows.
I completely agree with you. I think growing up watching television in the era that both of us did, it really informed to me what I thought a working actor meant.
Yes.
And also, there are certain actors that I have just a very specific kind of familial reaction to because they were in everything.
Yeah.
And it made me really appreciate character actors in general.
Same.
But like Jay Thomas is somebody that I see it, like I think of him from Mr. Holland's Opus. I think of him from Murphy Brown. I think of him just from so many things because I just knew him without being caught up in the celebrity of him. I knew him from his work and from recognizing him and his prolific career.
Yeah, he played himself on Sybil.
Sybil, of course.
Yeah, but at a time nowadays, the level of actor that he was, maybe not, name recognition to an audience, would not have played himself. But back then, he was just the sitcom guy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it dawned on me, though, that what Jay Thomas in the 90s was to television is what Kevin Pollak was to film in the 90s.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Kevin Pollak. Same reaction.
He's the Kevin Pollak of television.
Done. So
there you
real.
go, right? So Jay Thomas was born in 1948 in Texas, but surprisingly enough to many people he grew up in New Orleans, went to high school in Florida, I'm assuming just because of the proximity. He is not a New York Jew, as many people think assumed, and were many of the roles that he played. In fact, I couldn't find the article, but I remember reading that a Jewish organization wanted to honor him at one point, and he had to inform them that he was not in fact Jewish.
Well done.
Yes, right? That's a good actor.
Yeah.
And he actually won 2 Emmys for playing Jerry Gold, one for this season, not this episode. We'll get to it at the end of season 2. And then also his second episode as Murphy's love interest, his third episode, which would be the third season, Gold Rush, which is one of my favorites. And I do believe that he was robbed from his third Emmy because they changed the rules one year for guest actor. But I'll go into that later. I have a bit of an issue with that. He was robbed. Anyway, so he actually was a quarterback in high school. And I mention that because it'll become important when I talk about the later part of his career. Yes. But eventually his true passion was radio. He started off in high school and college and really, regionally became quite successful. This is something I didn't know until I read one of his obituaries, but he earned nicknames such as the Mouth of the South, the Scorpion, and the Prince of Darkness.
What the heck?
I know.
So he went from being like a radio DJ to like a metal guitarist.
Apparently, right? And it makes you go, well, of course he won 2 Emmys playing Jerry Gold. Maybe he is Jerry Gold? Don't know. Anyway, also interesting enough, at this time, a young Howard Stern was very influenced by him because eventually he did come to the New York market, which is, at least at the time, was a big radio market for someone of his caliber. So that was a really big, step up to get a job in New York. So apparently a young Howard Stern listened to him and he really idolized Jay. And I think you see that if you're familiar with Jay's radio work. I am not as familiar. I've listened to a couple of episodes. I'm more of a fan of his acting work. But he was quite popular. And at one point in the 90s in California, for Power 106 had the top rated morning show. Well, he was also doing television and had the radio shows. So he had a very long day. It's kind of amazing how he did that. But anyway, going back, his radio show in New York was 1976 to 1979. And he also was doing some stand-up, although he had said that he sort of started to realize that the comedy world and stand-up, the lifestyle, he wasn't really a comedian in that sense, But he did do stand-up. And he got a really big television gig in 1979 on Mork and Mindy as Remo Da Vinci.
Mork and Mindy.
He was in the first and second season. Now, I also should say that he did plays in New York. He did a play by Wendy Wasserstein. And at one point, he was directed by Barnett Kellman in a play. I can't find out what that play was, but that is significant, obviously, because it would help him later on when he met Barnett again.
Which Wendy Wasserstein did he do?
I'm pretty sure Isn't It Romantic? He was a replacement where he played a Jewish fellow.
Huh. Shocking.
Now, what's interesting is that I recently heard the story on the same podcast that I had referenced before, that things were not working out so well for the first season of Mork and Mindy. It was obvious they kept pushing the, storyline towards other people. And to get him to leave the show, they thought they would just put him in less episodes, shrink his order and pay him less. And most actors would go, well, how dare you? And then would leave the show. But he didn't have an agent at the time. In fact, he said he was literally picking up his $10,000 checks at the window with like the drivers.
That's so real.
So they called him in New York, his lawyer, and was like, well, this was going to happen. And he was like, well, $9,000 a week for maybe 8 out of 13 episodes is not bad. Like, I'll take it. It was very obvious they didn't want him there.
Yeah.
But I kind of love that story. It's like, well, yeah. Like right now I would take that, right? $9,000.
Honestly, I think that's one of the best career moves you can make, is to just, when people are pulling that kind of politics, just blink and be like, I don't know this is happening. It drives them insane.
Yes, right. He's in an episode of Family Ties with Susie Plaxton, who eventually starred in Love and War with him. We love Susie. Love and War was created by Diane, and we'll get into that later. A very famous guest spot on Golden Girls. And then famously, sort of I think most people around that time before Murphy Brown would have known him from Cheers, where he played Eddie LeBeck.
Oh, yeah.
Who was married to Carla. They had twins. And then eventually in 89, so around this time, he just died in a Zamboni accident, dressed as a penguin, which I believe
Typical.
Is why he's in a whale outfit later on in Murphy Brown. But we'll get into that later. But he was famously fired from Cheers because on his radio show, he was making jokes about Rhea Perlman. And he said one that was a little too far. Again, Howard Stern, think of this, he is a controversial character, and I don't want to sugarcoat Jay, this is who he was. And Diane English has actually said that she found him so funny on the radio that one time driving in her car, she almost hit an abutment. He thought he was going to be a series regular, and instead they fired him and made BB Newirth a series regular. So,
I mean, which as somebody who's a big fan of Frasier and the insanity that is Lilith, it opened a window, is all I'm going to say.
Seriously, though, because then he was able to do Murphy Brown, really.
Exactly. So it all worked out.
It all worked out. And then when Diane left Murphy Brown after the 4th season and created a show called Love and War, which is loosely based on her relationship with her husband at the time, with Susan Day and eventually Annie Potts, who I think was much better for the two of them. I loved their chemistry together. And also Joanna Gleason was in this show. He played a Jewish fellow. I think you see a trend here. And then eventually also appeared in Ink as the same character, which was a show that Diane came on to retool, which was with Mary Steenburgen and Ted Danson. So other than Candice Bergen, he has done the most Diane English work, which, I think is great. Some people just find, I don't want to say the word muse, but someone who just gets their writing and they write really well to them. Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason that, like, you see a lot of Bradley Whitford in Sorkin-esque roles, even if it's not Sorkin. It's somebody who gets the writing, who knows how to deliver it, who just has we talk about Sorkin a lot, big fans. Somebody who can do a walk and talk. The second that somebody does that really well, you're going to keep bringing them back because they just know what they're doing.
Now, I'm going to jump ahead because it's funny that you mentioned The West Wing or Aaron Sorkin, because something else I found out from this podcast, which I never knew, was that Jay had a final callback for The West Wing.
Of course he did.
But he got literally kicked out of his audition for saying something insulting that I cannot even say on this show. So I'm going to put a link to this podcast because you guys should listen to it. It was so insulting that he left LA to move to New York for a while, where he did a radio show there. And I do remember I did not see him on TV for a while after that. So, and he said the casting director, this is what he said, every time he would see him, would hug him and go, that was the most amazing thing I ever saw. You tanked your career, but it was amazing.
Oh, how do I not know this?
I know. I don't know how I didn't know it either. I mean,
I'm so excited.
The Cheers thing didn't come out to like the oral history, so a lot of the stuff, comes out after the fact. And also he auditioned for Frank Fontana.
Yeah.
But everyone said that he was so insulting that when they thought of Jerry Gold, they thought, oh, well, this Jade Thomas character should be perfect. Because apparently he came in and insulted Barnett Kellman because he had known him back home. But it's funny because then years later, because I'd always known this story, on this same podcast, Jay told the story and he said, I went in for this character that was obnoxious, so I played the part. He was auditioning for Frank Fontana.
Okay.
So,
which I will say, that is one lens of Frank.
True. I mean, maybe that's how we saw it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that is like, we all meet different types of people. Some people are like, oh, they're so charming. Some people are like, oh, they're far too much. So he could be one that was just like, I don't find Frank charming. I think he's obnoxious and awful, so that's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
I will say, I feel like this is a great example of the line between being yourself and knowing that will take you somewhere, and finding restraint. You know, we talk a lot in our like Me Too era about people who are like, what? That's just the way I am. Like, you just gotta, you know, like, just everyone's allowed to be themselves, but I can't react the way I'm going to react. It's like, well, no, because you're assaulting people and crossing lines.
Yeah.
But there is something to be said about being yourself, even if that's unlikable, because eventually you're going to get the career you were meant to have. However, what I like is that within the story of Jerry Gold, of Jay Thomas being himself, it didn't always work out well for him.
Yeah.
And it's nice to be like, yeah, well, luckily a perfect role for you came up and you were given another chance in the industry. But there is a risk to being like, I'm just going to be myself.
Yeah, like I admire him for it. Actually,
Yeah.
I do as well. And eventually, you know, he had a very popular Sirius FM show. It was extremely popular. And I also should put a link. There's a really great tribute that his show did to him. That was, you know, really lovely. I think a lot of people also will know Jay from his many appearances on Late Night with David Letterman. It became a tradition in the early 90s for him to come on, tell his Long Ranger story, and then hit a meatball off the top of a Christmas tree. Yes.
Oh.
With a football. Again, I told you that the quarterback thing would come back again. And only 1 year he didn't do it.
Dang.
Yeah, because he was waiting backstage and there was some NFL guy on, again, I don't know, sportsy stuff, who couldn't get it off. And so Jay ran out. He wasn't supposed to come out from the dressing room, took the football, powered it, and took that meatball right off. And then it became a tradition. And David Letterman has said that he feels that it is the funniest story that he's ever heard. And it's based on a real story, but it's the way you tell the story. We mentioned his really great friendship with Richard Dreyfuss. Richard Dreyfuss brought him on a lot of projects, including a great series I loved called Max Bickford. But just quickly before we end, I want to just give this really great quote that Richard Dreyfuss said about Jay, which is, he was a hell of a companion and easy to work with. He was light on his feet intellectually, and he was fun. And he was, you know, very, very saddened to, as we all were. Jay passed away August 24th, 2017 of throat cancer. He had 3 children. I want to end on a kind of a nice story, not on the sadness of Jay's death. And one of his sons had been given up for adoption. His woman he was dating in college became pregnant. They both agreed that it was better for the child for him to be adopted. This child was named John Thomas, which is Jay Thomas's birth name.
Oh.
And he was known as JT.
Oh.
Jay Thomas's real name is John Thomas Terrell. And he changed his name, as we've mentioned in the past, for union purposes. J.T. Harding is actually a songwriter, and he's written songs for Uncle Kracker and Kenny Chesney. They found each other and became quite close, which is really lovely. And he said that not only did his adopted father work at a rock station, very similar, obviously, to, you know, Jay's story, named him not knowing after his birth father. And in his first apartment in LA, his son, JT, said that there was a big billboard for Jay's radio show out his window.
Oh.
Yeah. It's I'll put some clips. There's some really great stuff on the full story happen. In fact, he even said that Jay did the voiceover for a Twizzler commercial when he was a kid. And he was obsessed with that commercial and he never knew why. Yeah. It's really kind of beautiful. And particularly the interviews you see, you know, how close they got. Jay actually spoke at JT's father's funeral.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, it's really quite lovely.
Join us next week for part 2. Sidebar while we're pat. Oh, I can't hear you. Why can't I hear you?
Oh, hello?
I thought you were like pausing to be like, okay, and we move on. I was going to be like, well, we're paused. And then I saw your hands moving and I was like, oh no, she's talking.
How do we know that Lauren's talking? Her hands are moving.